Welcome, dear listeners, to Miss Marple and the Widow's Forbidden Secret, a cozy mystery in the timeless style of Agatha Christie. Join the sharp-witted Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a tangled web of secrets in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead. Settle in with a cup of tea, relax, and let the intrigue unfold. This audiobook is divided into 10 chapters for your enjoyment. Our story begins now. Chapter 1. The Shadow over Rose Cottage. In the autumn of 1952, the village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in a gentle fold of the English countryside, where rolling green hills met hedgerows bursting with wild roses and blackberries. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, mingling with the faint smoke of chimneys that dotted the slate-roofed cottages. Church bells tolled softly on Sunday mornings, their chimes drifting over the high street, where villagers exchanged pleasantries and shared news over garden gates. It was a place where time seemed to pause, where life unfolded with the comforting rhythm of seasons, and where secrets, though whispered, rarely stayed hidden for long. At the heart of the village stood Rose Cottage, a charming, ivy-clad house with mullioned windows and a garden that bloomed with late dahlias and chrysanthemums. It was the home of Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, a widow of 62 who had lived there alone since her husband, Captain Hargrove, passed 5 years prior. Eleanor was a woman of quiet dignity, known for her neatly pinned gray hair, her impeccable manners, and her habit of taking afternoon tea precisely at 4 o'clock. To the villagers, she was a figure of respect, though not without a certain mystique. Whispers had long circulated about a forbidden secret from her youth, a scandalous affair in London before her marriage, hinted at but never confirmed. Miss Jane Marple, the elderly spinster whose unassuming presence belied a mind as sharp as a newly honed blade, sat in her tidy parlor at the edge of the high street. Her cottage, with its polished oak furniture and lace curtains, offered a perfect vantage point over the village. From her window she could observe the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead's residents, the postman's bicycle wobbling under the weight of letters, overturned on the saucer. The local doctor, Dr. Harold Finley, a bespectacled man with a perpetually furrowed brow, had been summoned at once. After a brief examination, he pronounced the cause a heart attack, citing Eleanor's age and a history of mild palpitations. The villagers nodded solemnly, offering condolences. But the whispers began almost immediately. Miss Marple first heard the news at the tea shop, a cozy establishment run by Mrs. Price, the postmistress, whose knack for gossip rivaled her skill with scones. The shop was abuzz with villagers, their voices low but eager, as they sipped tea and nibbled on biscuits. Mrs. Price, her round face flushed with excitement, leaned across the counter toward Miss Marple, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of sharing a tidbit. "You mark my words, Miss Marple," she said, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. "Eleanor Hargrove was as fit as a fiddle last week. I saw her in the garden, pruning roses with more vigor than I've got in my knees. A heart attack? I don't believe it for a minute. And that forbidden secret of hers. Everyone knows she kept something locked away in that old trunk in her attic. A letter, they say, from her wild days in London. Something scandalous enough to ruin reputations even now." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was already turning. "People do love their secrets, don't they, Mrs. Price?" she remarked, her tone mild. "But perhaps it's nothing more than village gossip. After all, a letter is just paper and ink." Mrs. Price huffed, unconvinced, and bustled off to serve another customer. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Rose Cottage. She recalled seeing Eleanor only days ago, walking to the post office with a brisk step, her face serene but her eyes carrying a hint of preoccupation. There had been no sign of frailty, no indication of a heart ready to give out. And the mention of a letter, well, that was intriguing. Miss Marple knew that in St. Mary Mead, her apron. Lily was a local girl, barely 20, known for her quiet devotion to her mistress. But there was something in her hurried steps that piqued Miss Marple's interest. Back in her parlor, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly. The mysterious incident, a suspicious death masked as a heart attack, centered on a hidden letter revealing Eleanor's forbidden secret of an illicit affair, gnawed at her. The method, she suspected, was poison, subtly administered in Eleanor's chamomile tea, a beverage she drank daily without fail. The poison, perhaps arsenic or something equally innocuous in small doses, could easily be mistaken for a natural death. Dr. Finley's diagnosis seemed too convenient, and Constable Slack's dismissal too hasty. Miss Marple's mind wandered to the suspects who might have had reason to silence Eleanor. There was Arthur Hargrove, Eleanor's nephew from London, a slick young man with a reputation for gambling debts, who stood to inherit Rose Cottage and its contents. Had he grown impatient? Then there was Mrs. Violet Crump, the nosy neighbor whose cottage shared a hedge with Eleanor's, known for her sharp tongue and envy of Eleanor's refined manners. Dr. Finley himself could not be overlooked. His heart pills might have been tampered with, intentionally or not. Lily Bates, with her access to the tea and her nervous demeanor, was another possibility. And Mr. Reginald Pettigrew, the village solicitor who handled Eleanor's will, might know more about the mysterious letter than he let on. As the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and gazed out her window. The high street was quiet now, the villagers retreating to their homes. But Rose Cottage stood silent, its windows dark. She thought of Eleanor, a woman whose life had been orderly, predictable, yet shadowed by a past she kept locked away. Human nature, Miss Marple mused, was predictable in its unpredictability. People clung to their secrets, but secrets had a way of slipping out. Ivy, and surrounded by a garden of late-blooming asters. Her steps were measured, her eyes bright with purpose. For she knew that in the vicarage, where gossip flowed as freely as tea, she might glean the first threads of the mystery surrounding Eleanor's death. The Reverend Leonard Clement, a gentleman with a scholarly stoop, welcomed her at the door, his kindly face creased with concern. His wife Griselda, a vivacious young woman with a penchant for bright scarves and brighter laughter, bustled in with a tray of scones and a steaming teapot. The vicarage parlor was a cozy haven, its walls lined with books and its hearth aglow with a small fire to ward off the October chill. Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered armchair, her knitting bag at her side, though she had no intention of knitting today. Her hands, she felt, were better employed in unraveling the knots of human nature. "Such a dreadful thing about poor Eleanor," Griselda said, pouring tea with a flourish. "I saw her only last week at the Women's Institute, organizing the fete with her usual precision. She seemed a bit distracted, though, kept glancing at her watch as if expecting someone." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite sympathy. But her mind seized on the detail. Expecting someone. That was new. "People do get distracted," she remarked, especially when life grows complicated. Was she quite herself otherwise? Griselda tilted her head, her curls bouncing. Well, now you mention it, she was a touch snappish with her nephew, Arthur Hargrove. He's down from London, you know, all slick suits and city airs. I overheard them arguing outside Rose Cottage, something about her will and that old trunk in the attic. Arthur seemed awfully keen to know what was in it. The Reverend, stirring sugar into his tea, looked up. Arthur's a restless sort, isn't he? Always talking of investments and quick fortunes. I do hope he wasn't troubling Eleanor unduly. She was such a dignified woman, so private about her past. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Arthur Marple recalled Mrs. Crump, a plump woman with a sharp tongue and an insatiable curiosity. Her cottage shared a boundary with Rose Cottage, and her windows offered a clear view of Eleanor's garden. Envy, Miss Marple knew, could be a powerful motive, especially if Mrs. Crump believed Eleanor's secret threatened her own standing in the village's social hierarchy. And Dr. Finley, the Reverend added, his voice gentle but troubled. He's been prescribing heart pills for Eleanor for years. I saw him leaving her cottage the day before she died, looking rather flustered. Do you suppose an overdose, perhaps? By accident, of course. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if itching to pick up her knitting needles. Dr. Harold Finley was a competent but nervous man, prone to over-explaining his diagnoses. An overdose of heart pills was a possibility, but the chamomile tea, with its faint residue she'd noticed in her mind's eye, suggested something more deliberate. Arsenic, perhaps, disguised as a natural death. Dr. Finley's access to Eleanor's medication made him a suspect worth considering. As the Clements chatted, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to a stray thread on the Reverend's sleeve, dangling like a clue in a puzzle. It wasn't significant, merely a sign of Griselda's haphazard mending, but it reminded her how small details could unravel grand deceptions. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the vicarage door. Griselda sprang up, returning with Lily Bates, Eleanor's young maid, who stood hesitantly in the doorway, her apron twisted in her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple," Lily said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know where else to go. I saw something at Rose Cottage, but I daren't tell Constable Slack. He'd think I'm making it up." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes were keen. "Come, Lily, sit down and tell us. No one will think you're making things up here." Lily perched on the edge of a chair, her cheeks flushed. "It was yesterday morning, before Mrs. Hargrove was found. I was dusting the sitting room and I saw Mr. Let's not jump to conclusions, my dear. Eleanor's death may still be natural. But I must say, Miss Marple, you have a way of making one see shadows where there were none." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Shadows are often cast by something real, Reverend. It's only a matter of finding the source." As she left the vicarage, the suspects took shape in her mind. Arthur Hargrove, driven by greed. Mrs. Violet Crump, fueled by envy. Dr. Harold Finley, possibly negligent or worse. Lily Bates, with access to the tea and a nervous demeanor. And Mr. Reginald Pettigrew, whose knowledge of Eleanor's secrets made him a dark horse. Each had a motive, whether money, jealousy, or shame, and each had been near Rose Cottage in the days before Eleanor's death. Stepping onto the high street, Miss Marple noticed the village coming to life, children playing hopscotch, the baker's van trundling by, and Mrs. Price waving from the tea shop. Yet beneath the cozy familiarity a current of suspicion ran. She recalled a similar case from her youth, in a village not unlike St. Mary Mead, where a seemingly natural death had hidden a poisoner's hand. The clue then had been a misplaced teacup, much like the one overturned at Rose Cottage. She made a mental note to examine the teapot more closely, for the residue she imagined might hold the key to the poison. Arsenic, subtle and deadly, hidden in Eleanor's chamomile. As she approached her cottage, Miss Marple saw Arthur Hargrove striding toward the post office, his face set in a scowl. He paused to light a cigarette, his hands unsteady, and glanced toward Rose Cottage as if drawn by an invisible thread. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Arthur's avoidance of chamomile tea, she recalled, was telling. Eleanor's favorite blend, served daily, was the perfect vehicle for poison. A red herring, perhaps in the form of Dr. Finley's heart pills, had been planted to mislead. But Miss Marple's instincts pointed to the tea. She entered her cottage, the familiar scent of lavender and beeswax soothing her senses. Sitting by the window, she gazed at Rose Cottage across the cottage, with its whitewashed walls and neatly trimmed hedges, was a haven of order. But her mind was far from tranquil. The death of Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, officially deemed a heart attack, lingered in her thoughts like a discordant note in a familiar tune. The whispers of a forbidden secret, a scandalous letter from Eleanor's youth, hidden in a locked trunk, had stirred her curiosity, and the possibility of poison in the widow's chamomile tea suggested a truth far darker than natural causes. Determined to observe the suspects in a setting where pretenses might slip, Miss Marple decided to host a small afternoon tea at her cottage, ostensibly to honor Eleanor's memory. She sent discreet invitations to those closest to the mystery. Arthur Hargrove, Eleanor's nephew, Mrs. Violet Crump, the nosy neighbor, Dr. Harold Finley, the village doctor, Lily Bates, Eleanor's maid, and Mr. Reginald Pettigrew, the solicitor. Each, she knew, held a piece of the puzzle, and in the relaxed intimacy of tea, their words and gestures might betray more than they intended. The parlor was prepared with care. A lace tablecloth draped the oak table, a silver teapot gleamed under the window's light, and a plate of scones, fresh from the bakery, sat beside a bowl of clotted cream. Miss Marple arranged the cups with precision, noting their delicate floral patterns, much like the village itself, beautiful but fragile when pressed. She wore her best gray dress, its simplicity belying the sharpness of her observation, and waited for her guests to arrive. Arthur Hargrove was the first to enter, his London suit looking stiff and out of place amid the chintz cushions. His dark hair was slicked back, and his smile, though charming, carried a hint of impatience. "Aunt Eleanor would have appreciated this, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair. "Though she was stubborn about her affairs. Refused to update her will, you know. That old trunk of hers, full of sentimental nonsense, I expect." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to his hands, which fidgeted with a cigarette case he didn't open. Sent satisfaction in Mrs. Crump's eyes. Envy, she knew, could twist neighborly curiosity into something venomous. Mrs. Crump's cottage overlooked Eleanor's garden, and her habit of peering through hedges made her a witness, perhaps to more than she admitted. Dr. Harold Finley arrived, adjusting his spectacles nervously. His graying hair was disheveled, and his hands trembled slightly as he accepted a cup. "Eleanor's heart was weak," he said, as if to convince himself. "I warned her about stress. Those pills I prescribed were perfectly safe. But people do talk, don't they?" "They do," Miss Marple agreed, her tone soothing. She observed his discomfort, wondering if it stemmed from guilt or merely the pressure of village scrutiny. An overdose of heart pills had been suggested as a red herring, but the tea, she felt, was the key. Lily Bates slipped in quietly, her young face pale and her apron slightly crumpled. She hesitated before taking a seat, her eyes darting to the teapot. "Mrs. Hargrove was so kind," she murmured. "I can't believe she's gone." As she reached for the sugar bowl, her hands shook, spilling a few granules onto the tablecloth. A nervous tell, Miss Marple noted, though it might mean nothing more than youth and grief. Mr. Reginald Pettigrew entered last, his tailored suit impeccable and his expression composed. He declined a scone with a polite smile, sipping his tea with the air of a man accustomed to control. "Eleanor's affairs were in order," he said firmly. "No secrets worth fussing over. Her will was straightforward, mostly to Arthur, with a few charitable bequests." Miss Marple watched him closely, recalling Lily's mention of seeing him with a key to Eleanor's trunk. His calm demeanor suggested confidence, but was it the confidence of innocence or calculation? The letter, rumored to reveal an illicit affair, might implicate someone close to Pettigrew, perhaps his own family. The conversation flowed, polite but strained, as the group mourned. Surfaced in Miss Marple's mind. A case from her youth in a neighboring village, where a poisoned teacup had been overlooked because of its ordinariness. She pictured Rose Cottage's sitting room, the overturned cup, the teapot with its faint, gritty residue. Arsenic, she suspected, could be concealed in something as mundane as sugar, stirred into Eleanor's daily chamomile. The heart pills, so easily blamed, were likely a distraction, planted to mislead the likes of Constable Slack. The tea gathering grew livelier as Griselda Clement arrived, invited as a neutral presence to ease tensions. Her bright chatter about the fete, new bunting, a raffle for jam, lightened the mood. But Miss Marple's focus remained on the suspects. Griselda mentioned seeing Eleanor arguing with Arthur near the post office, a detail that made him shift uncomfortably. "Just a family matter," he muttered, but his eyes avoided Miss Marple's. Mrs. Crump, emboldened by tea, leaned forward. "I always thought Eleanor was too proud," she said sharply. "All that talk of her London days as if we villagers were beneath her. That letter in her trunk, mark my words, it's trouble." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Letters can be troublesome, Mrs. Crump, but so can assumptions." Her words were gentle, but her mind catalogued the neighbor's bitterness. Was Mrs. Crump's gossip a mask for deeper resentment, perhaps tied to Eleanor's social standing? As the afternoon waned, the guests departed one by one, their polite farewells tinged with unease. Lily lingered, offering to help clear the cups, but Miss Marple waved her off kindly, noting the girl's reluctance to leave. Alone in her parlor, Miss Marple sat by the window, the village settling into evening quiet. The high street glowed under lamplight, and Rose Cottage stood silent, its secrets locked within. She reflected on the clues. Arthur's avoidance of chamomile, Mrs. Crump's pointed remarks, Dr. Finley's nervous residence. With a quiet determination, she prepared for the next step, certain that the widow's forbidden secret would soon come to light. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, curling around the chimneys and softening the outlines of its stone walls and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage gate, her shawl drawn close against the October chill, watching the village awaken. The baker's van rattled past and children's laughter echoed from the schoolyard. But her thoughts were fixed on Rose Cottage, where Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove had met her untimely end. The official verdict of a heart attack felt too tidy, like a poorly darned sock that would unravel under scrutiny. The whispers of a forbidden secret, a letter from Eleanor's youth, revealing an illicit affair locked away in an attic trunk, pointed to poison, likely arsenic, slipped into her chamomile tea. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, urged her to dig deeper. Determined to examine the scene of the crime, Miss Marple made her way to Rose Cottage, armed with a basket of condolence jam as a pretext. The cottage stood quiet, its garden still vibrant with late blooms, though the dahlias seemed to droop as if mourning their mistress. Constable Slack, young and earnest, stood at the gate, his uniform slightly too large for his frame. He tipped his hat, his face a mix of respect and impatience. "Miss Marple, there's nothing to see here," he said. "Dr. Finley's report was clear. Natural causes. No need to stir things up." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with gentle persistence. "Of course, Constable. I only wish to leave this jam for Lily. Poor girl must be quite shaken." Her tone was disarming, and Slack, flustered, let her pass with a mumbled warning to mind the steps. Inside the cottage was a study in order, its polished furniture and stark trace of metal shavings. Someone had been here recently, and not with innocent intent. As she rose, she heard a creak below. Lily Bates, Eleanor's maid, appeared at the foot of the stairs, her face pale and her hands clutching a duster. "Oh, Miss Marple," she gasped. "I didn't expect you. I was just tidying up." "No need to explain, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, though her eyes noted Lily's flushed cheeks and the way her duster trembled. "It must be hard, being here without Mrs. Hargrove." She descended, steering Lily to the sitting room, where the girl's nervousness seemed to grow. "Did you ever see anyone near the trunk, Lily? It looks as though it's been tampered with." Lily's eyes widened, and she shook her head too quickly. "No, miss. I dust up there sometimes, but I never touched it. Mrs. Hargrove was particular about that trunk." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple sensed there was more she wasn't saying. Returning to the village, Miss Marple reflected on the suspects. Arthur Hargrove, Eleanor's nephew, had the strongest motive: debts that Rose Cottage's sale could settle. Mrs. Violet Crump, the envious neighbor, had been vocal about Eleanor's unseemly past, perhaps knowing more than she let on. Dr. Harold Finley's nervous demeanor and access to medication made him a candidate, though the heart pills seemed a red herring. Lily's nervousness suggested guilt, but Miss Marple suspected it was fear, not malice. Mr. Reginald Pettigrew, the solicitor, with his knowledge of Eleanor's will and possible connection to the letter, remained a shadowy figure. At the tea shop, Miss Marple joined Griselda Clement for a cup, hoping to glean more village lore. Griselda, her scarf a vivid shade of crimson, was in high spirits, planning the fête's flower stall. Eleanor was to judge the roses this year, she said, her smile fading. She had such a way with them. But I heard from Mrs. Price that Eleanor's past wasn't all roses. That letter, they say, was from a married man she loved in London, before the captain. Could ruin someone even now. Cigarette smoke curling in the air. He was speaking to Dr. Finlay, their voices low but heated. Miss Marple, pretending to admire the churchyard roses, caught a fragment. "You should have been more careful," Arthur hissed. Dr. Finlay's reply was inaudible, but his shoulders slumped as he walked away. A clue? Or another distraction? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, the village bathed in twilight. The warmth of St. Mary Mead, neighbors sharing jam, children playing tag, contrasted with the cold calculation of murder. She recalled a case from her youth, where a forged note had misled the police, much like the heart pills here. A new clue surfaced in her memory. A forged note found in Eleanor's desk, implicating Dr. Finlay, had been mentioned by Constable Slack. Too obvious, she thought. A red herring meant to obscure the true method, the poisoned tea. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads together. The scratched trunk suggested someone sought the letter, perhaps to destroy or exploit it. Arthur's debts made him desperate, but his avoidance of chamomile hinted at knowledge of the poison. Mrs. Crump's binoculars pointed to spying, but was it malice or curiosity? Dr. Finlay's argument with Arthur suggested a secret, but his shaky hands might be mere nerves. Lily's fear could be innocence, and Pettigrew's composure hid something, perhaps a connection to the letter's scandal. The village's rhythm continued, fete banners fluttering, the postman's whistle. But Miss Marple knew the truth lay in the ordinary. The teapot, the trunk, the letter. These were the keys. She resolved to speak with Mrs. Crump next, to probe her gossip for truth. For now she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly, each stitch a step closer to unraveling the shadow over Rose Cottage. Chapter 5. The Garden Path. The late October sun filtered through the trees of St. Mary Mead, casting dappled patterns on the garden paths where villagers strolled, their chatter mingling with the rustle of leaves. Miss Jane Marple knelt by her rosebeds, her gloved hands deftly weeding, though her thoughts were far from the soil. The death of Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove at Rose Cottage, officially a heart attack, gnawed at her like a dropped stitch in a cherished scarf. The whispers of a forbidden secret, a letter from Eleanor's youth, revealing an illicit affair locked in an attic trunk, pointed to murder, with arsenic slipped into her chamomile tea. The scratched trunk, the overturned teacup, and the suspect's guarded behaviors fueled Miss Marple's resolve to unearth the truth. As she worked, Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the hedge separating her garden from the lane, where she spotted Mrs. Violet Crump arguing with Mr. Reginald Pettigrew, the solicitor. Their voices carried faintly, sharp with accusation. "You knew her secret," Mrs. Crump snapped, her plump figure quivering under a floral shawl. "Don't deny it, Reginald. I saw you skulking near her shed last week." Pettigrew's reply was cool, his tailored suit unruffled. "Nonsense, Violet. I was merely discussing her will. You'd do well to mind your own garden." He strode off, leaving Mrs. Crump fuming, her eyes darting toward Rose Cottage. Miss Marple's trowel paused. The shed, where Eleanor kept gardening supplies, might hold rat poison, arsenic, the perfect vehicle for murder, easily stirred into tea. Mrs. Crump's accusation, though laced with spite, suggested Pettigrew had opportunity. But was her gossip a clue or a distraction? Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Crump's binoculars, always trained on Eleanor's garden, and wondered if envy masked a deeper motive. Returning to her weeding, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other suspects. Arthur Hargrove, Eleanor's nephew, was desperate for money to set time. Did Mrs. Hargrove ever mention anything about her tea? Perhaps something unusual in its taste. Lily's hands trembled as she retrieved her needle. No, miss. She loved her chamomile, drank it every day. But... She hesitated, glancing around. I found a tin in the shed once, behind the gardening tools. It smelled odd, not like fertilizer. I thought it was nothing, but now I'm not sure. Miss Marple's heart quickened. A tin in the shed. Rat poison, perhaps? Did you tell anyone, Lily? She asked, her tone soft but probing. No, miss. I was afraid. Mrs. Hargrove was so kind, teaching me to read when I started working for her. I didn't want to cause trouble. Lily's voice broke, and Miss Marple patted her hand, sensing the girl's fear stemmed from loyalty, not guilt. As they spoke, Miss Marple noticed Dr. Finlay across the green, adjusting his spectacles as he examined a fete poster. His hands shook more noticeably than before, and she recalled the villagers' whispers of an overdose. Approaching him under the guise of discussing the fete, she said, Dr. Finlay, you must be busy with all this excitement. Eleanor's passing must weigh heavily, especially with talk of her heart pills. Finlay's face paled. The pills were perfectly safe, he insisted, his voice sharp. I checked her dosage myself. If anything, it was her nerves. She was worried about that letter, you know. Kept saying it could ruin someone. He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he'd said too much. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Letters can be troublesome, can't they? Like weeds in a garden. She noted his discomfort, wondering if his mention of the letter was a slip or a deliberate deflection. His shaky hands, she learned later from Griselda Clement, were due to arthritis, not guilt. A false lead, cleverly misleading. Her thoughts turned to the shed. She made her way to Rose Cottage, the fete. Eleanor would have loved this, she said. She always brought her best jam. But I saw her arguing with Arthur last month, you know. Something about selling the cottage. He was furious when she refused. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving connections. Arthur's greed was clear. But was he cunning enough to poison? Mrs. Crump's accusation against Pettigrew suggested opportunity, but her own spying raised questions. Dr. Finlay's arthritis explained his tremors, but his knowledge of the letter hinted at a secret. Lily's tin discovery was crucial, yet her fear suggested she was protecting someone, or herself. As the sun dipped, casting long shadows, Miss Marple walked home, the village alive with fete preparations. Children tying ribbons, neighbors laughing over shared pies. The warmth of St. Mary Mead contrasted with the chill of murder, a paradox that fueled her determination. She recalled a case from her youth where a poisoner had used a garden shed to hide their weapon, much like here. The tin, the scratched trunk, the letter. These were the threads of the mystery, and she was close to tying them together. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching Rose Cottage's dark silhouette. The arsenic, she was certain, had come from the shed, stirred into Eleanor's sugar by someone who knew her habits. But who? Arthur, with his debts. Mrs. Crump, with her envy. Pettigrew, guarding a family secret. Or someone else, hidden in plain sight. She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly, each stitch a step toward clarity. Tomorrow she would probe Mrs. Crump's gossip further, perhaps visiting her cottage to examine those binoculars. For now, the village's rhythm, its laughter, its shared stories, grounded her, reminding her that truth lay in the ordinary, waiting to be unearthed like a weed from a well-tended garden. Chapter 6. Twists in the Lane. The twilight of St. Mary Mead wrapped the village in a soft violet glow, as lamplights flickered to life along the high street. Leave it be. No signature, no clue to its sender, but the warning was clear, a thread in the mystery tugging at her curiosity. She tucked the letter into her knitting bag, her mind racing. The anonymity suggested fear, perhaps from someone close to the scandalous letter. Arthur Hargrove, Eleanor's nephew, with his gambling debts and eagerness to sell Rose Cottage, seemed a likely candidate. Mrs. Violet Crump, the envious neighbor, might fear exposure of her own secrets. Dr. Harold Finley, with his nervous demeanor, could be protecting his reputation. Lily Bates, the maid, seemed too frightened to write such a note, but her access to the tea made her a possibility. Mr. Reginald Pettigrew, the solicitor, with his calm exterior and possible link to the letter's scandal, was not above suspicion. The next morning, Miss Marple set out for the village green, where the fete preparations were in full swing. Stalls were draped with colorful bunting, and the air carried the sweet scent of jam tarts and the hum of neighborly chatter. She spotted Arthur Hargrove near the raffle tent, his London suit rumpled, his cigarette dangling as he argued with a vendor. Miss Marple, pretending to admire a display of marrows, overheard him mutter, "I was in London that morning, I swear." A train ticket poked from his pocket, but its edge was frayed, as if deliberately worn to suggest use. A false alibi, she suspected, meant to deflect scrutiny. Approaching him under the guise of fete business, she said, "Mr. Hargrove, you must be eager for the raffle. Eleanor always enjoyed these events, didn't she?" Arthur's smile was tight. "She did, Miss Marple, but she was stubborn about the cottage. Wouldn't sell, no matter how much I needed the money." His eyes flicked to Rose Cottage, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his jaw. His avoidance of chamomile tea, she recalled, hinted at knowledge of the poison. Arsenic, stirred into Eleanor's sugar. As she moved through the crowd, Miss Marple spotted Mrs. Crump by the flower green. "Poor girl's beside herself, says she found a sugar spoon in the wrong drawer at Rose Cottage. Odd, don't you think? Eleanor was so particular." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A misplaced sugar spoon, possibly tainted with arsenic, was a vital clue, overlooked by Constable Slack's hasty investigation. "Very odd," she agreed, her tone mild. "People's habits are telling, aren't they?" Griselda nodded, then lowered her voice. I heard Dr. Finley talking to Pettigrew yesterday near the church. Something about Eleanor's will and that letter. Finley seemed rattled, said it could ruin everything. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Dr. Finley's arthritis explained his shaky hands, but his knowledge of the letter suggested a deeper connection. Was he protecting a family secret, perhaps tied to the affair? Pettigrew, with his composed demeanor, might know more than he let on, especially if the letter implicated his kin. As she left the tea shop, Miss Marple passed Rose Cottage, where Lily was sweeping the path. The girl's eyes were red, her movements jerky. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing around. "I found something else, in the shed. A scrap of paper with Mr. Pettigrew's initials. I didn't tell anyone, I swear." Miss Marple patted her arm. "You've done right to tell me, dear. Keep it quiet for now." The scrap, she suspected, was another red herring, planted to shift blame. Pettigrew was too meticulous to leave such evidence, but someone wanted him implicated. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the anonymous letter in her lap. The village's warmth, children tying fete ribbons, neighbors sharing laughter, contrasted with the cold intent of murder. She recalled a case where a false clue, like the frayed train ticket, had misled the police. Arthur's alibi was shaky, but was he cunning enough to poison? Mrs. Crump's binoculars suggested spying, but was it malice or curiosity? Dr. Finley's slip about the letter hinted at fear, not guilt. Lily's discoveries, the tin, the spoon, the scrap, pointed to her innocence, but someone was manipulating the evidence. The sugar spoon, Miss Marple decided, was the key. Clarity. The truth, she knew, lay in the ordinary, habits, glances, and misplaced objects that defined St. Mary Mead's gentle rhythm. Chapter 7. Unraveling Threads. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across her parlor floor. Outside, St. Mary Mead hummed with its usual rhythm. Children skipping to school, the postman's whistle echoing down the lane. But Miss Marple's mind was far from the village's gentle routine. The death of Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, officially a heart attack, was a murder in her eyes. The work of arsenic slipped into chamomile tea. The forbidden secret, a scandalous letter from Eleanor's youth locked in an attic trunk, held the key. And the clues were mounting. A scratched trunk, a tin of rat poison in the shed, a misplaced sugar spoon, and an anonymous warning note. Miss Marple's knitting lay idle, her fingers itching to weave the threads of the mystery into a coherent pattern. Her visit to Rose Cottage the previous day had yielded a crucial discovery. Under the pretext of retrieving a forgotten handkerchief, she had persuaded Lily Bates, Eleanor's maid, to let her into the sitting room. There, tucked in a vase of dried lavender, Miss Marple had found a small key, its brass surface worn but intact. It fit the attic trunk, she was certain, and with Lily distracted by sweeping, she had slipped upstairs. The trunk's lock clicked open, revealing a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. The topmost one, in elegant script, confirmed the village whispers. An affair with a married man, Mr. Charles Pettigrew, the solicitor's father, from Eleanor's London days. The letter named Reginald Pettigrew as their illegitimate son, a secret that could ruin his standing in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had replaced the letter, her heart heavy with the weight of Eleanor's past. This was motive enough for murder, but was Pettigrew the killer? She recalled his composed demeanor at her tea gathering, his careful words about Eleanor's will. "The scratch guess," she said, her eyes wide. Dr. Finley's prescription bottle, the one for Eleanor's heart pills, was found in Rose Cottage's dustbin, with a gritty residue inside. Constable Slack thinks it's nothing, but it's odd, don't you think? Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Arsenic, she suspected, not heart medication. But the bottle was too obvious, another red herring meant to implicate Finley. Very odd, she agreed, her tone mild. People are careless with their belongings, aren't they? Griselda nodded, then lowered her voice. And Lily told me she found a vial in her apron pocket yesterday, thought it was perfume. But it smelled sharp, like chemicals. She's terrified. Says someone must have slipped it there. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A vial in Lily's pocket was another attempt to shift blame, but it confirmed her suspicion. The killer was planting clues to mislead. Lily's fear, her loyalty to Eleanor ruled her out. The true clue lay in the sugar spoon, misplaced in a drawer Eleanor never used, tainted with arsenic by someone less familiar with her habits. Later, Miss Marple strolled to the village green, where the fete stalls were nearly complete. She spotted Arthur Hargrove near the tea tent, his gloves crumpled in his hand. As he lit a cigarette, she caught a faint whiff of chamomile, a curious detail given his avoidance of the tea. Approaching him, she said, "Mr. Hargrove, you seem fond of the fete's bustle. Eleanor must have loved these gatherings." Arthur's smile was strained. She did, but she was too stubborn to see reason about the cottage. I needed that money. His gloves, she noted, had a faint stain, as if they'd brushed against something gritty, sugar perhaps, or poison. At the flower stall, Mrs. Crump was arranging roses, her binoculars tucked away. Eleanor's garden was a show-off, she muttered when Miss Marple greeted her. Always lording it over mine. That letter of hers. I bet it's why she died. Her spite was palpable, but Miss Marple sensed it was a mask for something personal, perhaps a long-ago slight. Returning suggested knowledge, but his arthritis and earnestness leaned toward innocence. Pettigrew, she recalled, had been seen near the shed, where the arsenic tin lay. His motive, protecting his illegitimacy, was stronger than most. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the village alive with the soft glow of lamplights and the laughter of fete preparations. The warmth of St. Mary Mead, neighbors sharing stories, children tying ribbons, contrasted with the cold calculation of murder. She pieced together the clues. The letter naming Pettigrew, the scratched trunk, the tainted spoon, Arthur's stained gloves, the planted vial. The arsenic, she was certain, had been stirred into Eleanor's sugar, not her tea leaves, by someone who knew her habits but fumbled her routine. Pettigrew emerged as the strongest suspect, his calm masking a desperate need to hide his parentage. Yet Arthur's desperation and Mrs. Crump's envy couldn't be dismissed. The anonymous note suggested fear of exposure, pointing to someone with much to lose. Miss Marple resolved to gather the suspects again, perhaps at the village hall, to test their reactions. For now she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly, each stitch a step toward unraveling the truth hidden in St. Mary Mead's ordinary moments. Chapter 8. The Narrowing Circle. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in hues of amber and gold as the fete preparations reached their peak. The air was alive with the chatter of neighbors, the clink of teacups, and the laughter of children tying ribbons to stalls. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the village green, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her eyes scanning the crowd with the quiet intensity of a hawk. The death of Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, dismissed as a heart attack, was murder in her mind. Arsenic, slipped into chamomile tea, orchestrated by someone guarding a forbidden secret. The letter in the attic trunk, revealing Eleanor's affair with Mr. Charles Pettigrew, and naming the solicitor Reginald Pettigrew as their illegitimate son, was motive in this memorial, he said, his voice tight. Aunt Eleanor would have liked it, though she was too stubborn to share her wealth. His stained gloves, faintly scented with chamomile, caught Miss Marple's eye, a clue to his handling of the poisoned sugar, perhaps. Mrs. Crump bustled in, her floral hat askew, her binoculars tucked into her bag. "I suppose we're honoring Eleanor's roses," she said, her tone sharp. "She always thought hers better than mine. That letter of hers, pure scandal, I'm sure." Her bitterness, Miss Marple noted, hid a personal grudge, perhaps deeper than mere envy. Dr. Finley followed, his spectacles slipping as he clutched a FET program. "I hope this puts the rumors to rest," he muttered. "My pills had nothing to do with her death. I told her to avoid stress, what with that letter worrying her." His arthritis, confirmed by Griselda, ruled out deliberate poisoning, but his knowledge of the letter intrigued Miss Marple. Lily Bates slipped in quietly, her apron gone, but her hands twisting nervously. "I wanted to help with the FET," she whispered, avoiding eye contact. "Mrs. Hargrove was so kind to me." The vial in her pocket, mistaken for perfume, was a planted distraction, Miss Marple was certain, meant to frame her. Reginald Pettigrew entered last, his tailored suit impeccable, his smile measured. "A fitting tribute to Mrs. Hargrove," he said smoothly. "Her affairs were in order, I assure you." His composure, Miss Marple thought, was a mask for fear. The letter's revelation of his illegitimacy was a motive too strong to ignore. As the group settled, Miss Marple opened the discussion with gentle tact, steering it toward Eleanor's life. "She was a woman of habits," she said, her voice soft but probing. "Her chamomile tea, for instance, taken every afternoon. Such routines can reveal much, don't you think?" Arthur shifted uncomfortably, his gloves now tucked away. "She was set in her ways," he said. "Too set, if you ask me." His evasion of the tea topic was telling, Miss Marple. Pettigrew's voice cut through the tension. "All this talk of letters is nonsense," he said coolly. "Eleanor's will was clear. Arthur inherits, with minor bequests. No need for drama." His calm was almost too perfect, and Miss Marple's eyes caught a glint on his cufflink. A rose design, identical to one she'd seen in Rose Cottage's sitting room, dropped near the teapot. The room grew quiet, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the clues. The letter named Pettigrew, giving him motive to silence Eleanor before she destroyed it. The scratched trunk showed his attempt to retrieve it. The sugar spoon, misplaced, pointed to someone unfamiliar with Eleanor's routine, not Lily, but perhaps Pettigrew, who visited often. Arthur's stained gloves suggested he'd handled the sugar, but his motive, greed, was less personal than Pettigrew's shame. Mrs. Crump's envy seemed petty, and Finley's arthritis ruled him out. The vial and prescription bottle were distractions, planted to confuse. As the meeting ended, the suspects dispersed, their farewells strained. Arthur lingered, muttering about catching a train, his frayed ticket a false alibi. Mrs. Crump clutched her binoculars as if they held answers. Finley adjusted his spectacles, relieved to have spoken. Lily hurried off, her eyes downcast. Pettigrew paused at the door, his cufflink catching the light, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, a concrete clue, tying him to the crime scene. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the village aglow with fete lights. The warmth of St. Mary Mead, neighbors sharing jam, children's laughter, contrasted with the cold intent of murder. She recalled a case from her youth where a single overlooked detail, a button, much like a cufflink, had cracked the mystery. The sugar spoon, tainted with arsenic, was the linchpin, and Pettigrew's cufflink placed him at Rose Cottage, handling the tea tray. She resolved to confront the suspects again, perhaps at Rose Cottage, to test her theory. Pettigrew's motive was strongest, but Arthur's desperation and Mrs. Crump's spy heart attack. But to her, a calculated poisoning by arsenic slipped into chamomile tea. The letter in the attic trunk, revealing Eleanor's affair with Charles Pettigrew and naming his son, Reginald Pettigrew, as their illegitimate child, was the heart of the mystery. Clues: a scratched trunk, a tin of rat poison, a misplaced sugar spoon, a planted vial, an anonymous warning note, and a rose-embossed cufflink pointed to a killer desperate to keep the secret buried. The fete offered the perfect stage to observe her suspects. Arthur Hargrove, driven by gambling debts. Mrs. Violet Crump, fueled by envy. Dr. Harold Finley, nervous but likely innocent. Lily Bates, frightened but loyal. And Reginald Pettigrew, whose calm masked a devastating secret. Miss Marple had arranged to meet them at the tea tent, under the pretext of discussing Eleanor's fete contributions, hoping their interactions would reveal the final threads of the truth. Arthur Hargrove arrived first, his suit crumpled and his cigarette smoke curling above the crowd. "This fete's too cheerful for my mood," he muttered, glancing at Rose Cottage across the green. His stained gloves, faintly scented with chamomile, were tucked into his pocket, but Miss Marple noticed a fine powder on his cuff. Sugar, perhaps. Or arsenic. Eleanor loved these events, she said gently. "Did she ever share her tea recipe with you?" Arthur's eyes narrowed. "Never cared for chamomile," he said curtly. "Too bitter." His avoidance, coupled with the powder, strengthened Miss Marple's suspicion that he knew of the poison. Mrs. Violet Crump bustled up, her binoculars dangling as she adjusted her floral hat. "Eleanor's roses would have won today," she said, her tone dripping with resentment. "She always had to outshine me." Miss Marple noted her fidgeting hands, clutching a fete program with a torn corner, a detail that sparked a memory. "Hargrove," he said smoothly. "Her legacy lives on in these roses." His calm was unshaken, but Miss Marple noticed his fingers brush the cufflink, as if ensuring it was secure, a nervous tell, perhaps. As they sat in the tea tent, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Eleanor's habits. "Her chamomile tea was a ritual," she said, pouring cups for the group. "Such a simple thing, yet so telling." She watched their reactions. Arthur pushed his cup away. Mrs. Crump stirred hers vigorously. Finley sipped nervously. Lily hesitated, and Pettigrew drank with deliberate calm. The sugar bowl, she noted, was identical to the one at Rose Cottage, and a faint gritty texture caught her eye, a trace of arsenic, perhaps, overlooked by the fete organizers. A new clue emerged as Griselda Clement joined them, her scarf of vivid purple. "I found something odd," she whispered to Miss Marple. "A fete ribbon caught in Rose Cottage's shed door with a smudge of ink. Pettigrew stationery, I'd swear." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The ribbon tied Pettigrew to the arsenic tin, complementing the cufflinks' evidence. His motive, hiding his illegitimacy, was compelling. But Arthur's stained gloves and Mrs. Crump's torn program kept them in play. As the fete continued, Miss Marple wandered to the raffle stall where she overheard Arthur arguing with a villager. "I was in London that day," he insisted, waving his frayed train ticket. But Miss Marple, examining a raffle ticket nearby, noticed the ink matched the anonymous warning note. A clue suggesting Arthur's involvement, perhaps to deflect suspicion from himself. Mrs. Crump at the flower stall was showing off her roses, but paused to glare at Rose Cottage. "That letter," she muttered to a neighbor. "It's why she died. I saw Pettigrew near her shed, mark my words." Her accusation, though spiteful, aligned with the ribbon clue, but Miss Marple wondered if her binoculars had seen too much, implicating her in the poison's placement. Later, Miss Marple slipped away to Rose Cottage, using a spare key from Lily to enter the sitting room. The sugar bowl still on the table had a faint, powdery residue, suggested a conspiracy. Perhaps one suspect framing another. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her cottage fire, the fete's lights twinkling outside. The clues, letter, cufflink, ribbon, spoon, ticket, program, formed a pattern, with Pettigrew at its center. His motive was strongest, but Arthur's desperation and Mrs. Crump's envy lingered. The anonymous note, in Arthur's ink, suggested he knew of the letter's danger. Miss Marple resolved to confront Pettigrew directly, perhaps at his office, to test his composure. For now, she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly, each stitch a step toward unraveling the truth hidden in St. Mary Mead's gentle rhythm. Chapter 10. The Truth in the Tea Leaves. The evening air of St. Mary Mead carried the lingering warmth of the fete, with distant laughter and the soft glow of lanterns illuminating the village green. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, the fire casting flickering shadows across her lace curtains, her knitting untouched on the table. The murder of Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, dismissed by Constable Slack as a heart attack, was a puzzle nearing its solution in her sharp mind. Arsenic, slipped into Eleanor's chamomile tea, was the weapon, and the motive lay in a scandalous letter hidden in an attic trunk, revealing an affair with Charles Pettigrew and naming his son, Reginald Pettigrew, as their illegitimate child. The clues: a scratched trunk, a tin of rat poison, a misplaced sugar spoon, a planted vial, an anonymous warning note, a rose-embossed cufflink, and a smudged fete ribbon, pointed to a killer desperate to protect a secret. Tonight, Miss Marple would confront the suspects at Rose Cottage, using the truth to unravel the final threads. She had invited Arthur Hargrove, Mrs. Violet Crump, Dr. Harold Finley, Lily Bates, and Reginald Pettigrew to Rose Cottage, under the pretext of sorting Eleanor's belongings for the fete's charity auction. From arthritis. "I hope this brings closure," he said softly. "Eleanor's death was a shock, but my pills were safe, I swear." His mention of the letter at the fete, tying it to his Uncle Charles, confirmed his fear of a family scandal, but his physical limitations cleared him of poisoning. Lily Bates followed, her hands steady but her face pale. "I'll help however I can," she whispered, her eyes darting to the teapot. "Mrs. Hargrove was so kind to me." The absence of the vial and her loyalty to Eleanor convinced Miss Marple that Lily was a pawn, framed by planted clues. Reginald Pettigrew arrived last, his tailored suit pristine, his rose-embossed cufflink catching the lamplight. "A generous gesture, Miss Marple," he said smoothly. "Mrs. Hargrove would approve." His calm was unshaken, but his fingers brushed the cufflink, a nervous gesture, mirroring the one Miss Marple had seen at the fete. As they gathered, Miss Marple poured chamomile tea, her movements deliberate. "Eleanor's habits were her comfort," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Her tea, taken daily, was her ritual. Yet something was added to it. Arsenic, from the shed's tin, stirred into her sugar." She paused, watching their faces. Arthur's jaw tightened. Mrs. Crump's hands fidgeted. Finley flinched. Lily gasped. And Pettigrew's eyes narrowed slightly. She continued, holding up the sugar spoon. "This was found in the wrong drawer. A mistake by someone unfamiliar with Eleanor's routine, not Lily, who knew her ways." Lily's shoulders relaxed, but the others shifted uneasily. "And this cufflink," she said, producing a rose-embossed twin from her pocket, "was found near the teapot, dropped by someone careless." Pettigrew's hand froze on his cuff. "A common design," he said coolly, but his voice betrayed a tremor. Miss Marple pressed on. "The letter in the trunk revealed a secret. Eleanor's affair with Charles Pettigrew, and a child, Reginald. A secret worth killing, family's name. But I'd never harm her." His honesty and his arthritis cleared him, but his words tightened the noose around Pettigrew. Miss Marple turned to the solicitor. "The cufflink places you here, Mr. Pettigrew, as does the ribbon with your stationery zinc. The scratched trunk shows your attempt to destroy the letter. You visited often, knew Eleanor's habits, but not her exact routine, hence the misplaced spoon." Pettigrew's eyes darted to the door, but he remained silent. The room grew still, the village's fete sounds distant. Miss Marple's voice softened. "Eleanor planned to destroy the letter, to protect you, Reginald. But you feared its exposure, didn't you? So you used arsenic from the shed, stirred it into her sugar and left clues to frame others. The vial for Lily, the bottle for Finley, the ticket for Arthur." Pettigrew stood, his face ashen. "You've no proof," he said, but his voice shook. Miss Marple held up the cufflink. "This and the ribbon place you at the scene. The sugar bowl's scratch matches the trunk's lock, a tool you used." She paused. "Confess, Mr. Pettigrew, or Constable Slack will hear of this." The solicitor slumped, his calm shattered. "I couldn't let it out," he whispered. "My career, my life, it would have been ruined." His confession spilled like tea from a cracked pot, detailing how he'd slipped arsenic into the sugar, hoping to silence Eleanor before she destroyed the letter. Miss Marple nodded, her heart heavy but resolute. As Pettigrew was led away by a summoned Constable Slack, the others dispersed, shaken but relieved. Arthur muttered about debts. Mrs. Crump clutched her binoculars. Finley adjusted his spectacles, and Lily wept quietly. The village's warmth, fete lights twinkling, Neighbors sharing stories. Returned. But the shadow of murder lingered. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the fête's echoes fading. She recalled a case from her youth where a single detail, a scratched spoon, had revealed